Every lead, Mr. Claver said in his opening, came up empty. Absolutely right. Some of the investigation was sloppy, but it really got sloppy when Cristhian Bahena Rivera got targeted. Because folks, what happened here was they closed a case. They didn't solve a case. To coin a phrase from Agent Villada, in his mind, Cristhian Bahena cleared Rod and Pexa. I would expand on that. In his mind, Cristhian Bahena closed the case. Good enough for them. Let's close the case, shut the book, get everybody out of here, and we're done. But they didn't solve the case. They didn't get enough evidence to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Claver, in his opening statement, also told you that they found the video of the Malibu. That was good police work. That was good police work. We're not going to suggest to you that Cristhian Bahena Rivera's Malibu was on that video. That was him. He testified to that. You saw him on the stand. Or that was him driving that car. We'll give you that. Absolutely was him. He said that Miss Tibbetts' blood was in Cristhian's Malibu in the trunk. That's true too. We aren't going to dispute that at all. He didn't mention to you that there was a mixture of blood in the trunk. And they talked about Cristhian's quote unquote admissions, or what Mr. Brown called a confession, which we wholeheartedly disagree with. What is missing in this case? That's really what you got to look at. What is missing? Because there's a lot missing in this case. We don't have a murder weapon. No murder weapon ever was discovered in this case. And it wasn't for lack of looking, at least as it pertains to Cristhian Bahena Rivera. Okay? They found a folding knife at his trailer. They sent it into the DCI lab, tested it. No blood. No blood. They found another knife, black knife. Sent that in. No blood. Nothing. However, think way back to when Tara Scott talked about her initial crime scene analysis. Remember, she went to 622 West Des Moines Street. A couple days after Mollie went missing, they sent the DCI crime scene team up and they looked at the home at 622 West Des Moines Street. And they looked at it very, very closely. And what did she note? She noted in the hallway there was a gun safe with a number of guns in it. But of particular note was a loaded pistol. A loaded pistol in a little cabinet hanging on the wall with several knives, hunting style knives. Some of them were folding knives. I bet you if they went and looked, they may have found one with a camouflage handle. But they didn't bother to look. Why? Because they'd already made up their mind. We'll get to more of that later. What else don't they have? They don't have a primary crime scene. They don't have a primary crime scene. Where was Mollie Tibbetts killed? Was she killed on 385th Street? Did someone stab her 9 to 12 times along the blacktop where she was jogging? Did someone stab her in the throat or do the slashing motion of the throat and stab her several times in the rib and then penetrate her skull on 385th Street, where you heard about where all these houses are and the cars that were traveling out there, and they talked to darn near, I would submit, every one on 385th Street, and they didn't find one piece of evidence, not any blood. They had it narrowed down. We saw the map of the cell phone technology. They had a pretty small window as to where they'd find something. Did they send any type of canines out there to find blood? Oh, well, the weather was bad. I forgot. It was humid. It was hot. It had rained. I mean, they have an excuse for every piece of evidence they don't have. But they don't have a primary crime scene. Or was she killed on the 460th Avenue address? Did someone take her 430 feet back in this location and kill her there? We don't know. What investigation did they do to find a primary crime scene next to the cornfield? Or was she killed right there in the cornfield? I highly doubt that. I highly doubt someone killed her right in the rows of corn and there wasn't some other evidence there to establish that. We don't have a primary crime scene. Well, they'll pass it off and explain it away by, well, it's been 5 weeks, the weather was bad, the corn was tall. You know, they'll find an excuse for everything. That's not Mr. Bahena's problem, okay? That's their problem. They have to prove it, not him, okay? They had the unlimited resources of the federal government. They had drones up in the air. They brought a guy in from Dayton, Ohio, for the sole purpose of analyzing the data from one cell phone. And that's the evidence they put on here. They had unlimited resources. Unlimited resources. Mr. Claver told you in the opening statement his sheriff was up flying around in a helicopter. And they can't even tell you where she was killed. No evidence come off that stand as to where she was killed. None. No forensic evidence at all. They don't have an eyewitness. They have no witnesses. Zero. None. They talk about a confession. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But we dispute greatly that what they attribute to Cristhian Bahena as a statement can be characterized as a confession. Absolutely cannot be. Absolutely cannot be. Motive. Now, motive, Mr. Brown talked about. But you really have to use your common sense here, folks. You really got to think about this one. This man, right here, 5'7", 125-pound illegal immigrant, undocumented immigrant, gets angry at Mollie Tibbetts, who he had never met before, who he was trying to get to know, if you believe that story, and resorts to killing her, stabbing her 9 times, or maybe 12, 3 more times, because he's angry. The only evidence they have of his anger is this story he gave Pamela Romero. The evidence we do have about Cristhian Bahena is that he's not an angry man, that he's not violent, that he's a family man, he's hardworking. He came to this country for a reason. And you can bet he wanted to stay in this country. And the concept that he got angry and killed a woman who he had just met defies any logic. Folks, we've all been rejected in our lives. We've all perhaps have walked up to someone, had the courage to ask them on a date, or had the courage to try to get to know someone, and been told no. May have been told no in an epic way, been embarrassed by that person. You common sense tells you that you aren't going to just stab that person, let alone a person like Mollie Tibbetts. It makes no sense. They have no motive as to why this man would commit that act. And then they have no scientific evidence that connects him to the killing. They want to talk about the trunk, and they want to talk about the cornfield, both of which we admit. But having her in the trunk and putting her in the cornfield does not mean he killed her. Think about that. The burden of proof is on the state to prove all that. And that, folks, when you look at what's missing, is a reasonable doubt. What is a reasonable doubt? A reasonable doubt, long and short of it is, the judge will tell you that if after a fair and full consideration of all the evidence, or lack of evidence, okay? If they don't produce the evidence, that's just like evidence you can consider. Lack of evidence produced by the state. Mr. Bahena doesn't have to produce anything. He doesn't have to tell the state anything when he has the opportunity. He doesn't have to, when he's questioned, tell the state about these two masked men. It's not his obligation. It's their obligation to prove it. Don't let him shift anything. Don't let him oversimplify and make it sound like he has to do anything. Their burden. You have to be firmly convinced of his guilt as to each and every element. All four, in order to convict him. If not, you must find him not guilty. Now, what does firmly convinced mean? Good question. You're not going to find anywhere in those instructions where it's defined what firmly convinced means. You have to determine for yourself what that means. I would suggest to you that in your deliberations, to be firmly convinced, you're going to need to know that Cristhian Bahena did this. You can't just think he did this. You must know that based upon the evidence that they have produced, that he killed Mollie Tibbetts, that he committed this crime, and the state has proven these elements. You best know. You best not think. That's the difference between whether or not you're firmly convinced. Instruction 14 defines murder in the first degree. Element number 2 is that Mollie Tibbetts died as a result of being stabbed. We admit that. There's no doubt about that. Somebody stabbed her, and as a result of those stab wounds, she's dead. No problem. But the state has monumental issues with 1, 3, and 4. Monumental issues. We'll go through those. Element 1. What evidence has the state produced to prove element 1? They have a drop of blood on the trunk seal. And look at that photo. The drop of blood is a centimeter. I mean, it's small, okay? They have her DNA in the trunk and her body in the cornfield that Cristhian took him to, okay? All facts that we don't dispute. He testified to that. But what must you believe to establish element number 1? You must believe the testimony of Pamela Romero. Okay? Now, Mr. Bahena told them enough to get them to the body. Okay? This was an 11-hour interrogation. 11 hours. Okay? After he had worked a full day at the dairy. Okay, now he works at the dairy. That's hard work. And if you think it's a coincidence that they waited till the end of the workday to get this guy and bring him back and question him, you got another thing coming. So he'd worked since 4:30 in the morning. They get him. He voluntarily agrees to go speak. He's compliant. He's a yes man. He talks to Pamela Romero and other officers for 11 hours after working in a dairy where he works, mind you, 12 hours a day plus 12 out of every 14 days. He tells them enough to take him to the body. Why did he do that? Very simple. He was protecting his own. He was protecting his daughter Iris. He was protecting the mother of Iris, or protecting his daughter Paulina and the mother Iris. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Now, this 11-hour interrogation was recorded. And you can see from the photographs, those are snapshots from the interview, that there were times where English speakers were in there. Okay? Agent Valletta speaks English. You heard Christian testify the guy standing up was yelling at him in English. Agent Valletta was calling him a liar at the point he's sitting here. Yet, you didn't get the benefit of seeing any of the interview and judging for yourself the credibility of Cristhian Bahena's statement or the authenticity of that interview. Think about that. This case had the unlimited resources of the federal government there. FBI, right there. DCI, right there. These guys are the best of the best that we have. These guys know how to interview. They've handled homicide case after homicide case after homicide case. They've interviewed people over and over and over again. And they send in Pamela Romero, a cop who had a total of about 2.5 years experience, whose law enforcement training was only the academy, and 16 hours of interrogation and interviewing training. Folks, you spent 12 in jury selection. Cristhian Bahena spent 12 hours working that day. They sent the most inexperienced officer they could into a marathon interrogation with a suspect in a homicide case that had more attention than they've ever known, because she was a quote-unquote native speaker. Now, why on earth would they not send in one of those agents who really knew how to interview and interrogate and let Ms. Romero do the translation? She was fluent, which, by the way, her saying she's fluent in Spanish is like one of us saying we're from Iowa, therefore we're fluent in English. There's a lot of people who speak English that aren't fluent, folks. That's just the way it is. Just because you grow up here doesn't mean you're fluent. We can speak the language, but I would submit you wouldn't be the best at translating. You wouldn't be the best at interpreting. Agent Valletta wanted to sit behind the curtain and control the interview. But the problem is, when they come here to the courtroom and want to produce evidence, they can't because now it's all in Spanish. So now the state can sit at the table and sit behind the curtain and produce the evidence by having Ms. Romero testify. And you folks can't judge the evidence.